The revision of history is a never-ending process. Each generation, it is said, rewrites history in light of its own experience. But when the historical event is a defeat in war, as Japan experienced in World War II, the impulse to ignore, explain away, or tidy up the defeat is particularly strong. In such cases, history becomes a source of shame. If the defeat is marked by large-scale atrocities on the battlefield, or by the initial aggression of the defeated power, as in Japan's case, the embarrassment is all the more humiliating, and the impulse to sanitize it all the stronger. A country is likely to go through a period of amnesia, during which its citizens simply do not want to think about the grim side of their recent past. This loss of memory can last for years. Sometimes, after the period of amnesia, history resurfaces in a distorted form. Its embarrassments are not remembered as clearly as its heroism or near victories. A country's own suffering is remembered more vividly than the suffering it caused. Before we actually dive into the Japanese educational system, let's first understand the two main atrocities committed by Japan in the 20th century, which is still far from covering or summarizing everything Japan did in the last century. In China, Imperial Japan's expansionism was facilitated by the vulnerabilities the country faced. During the 1930s, the Chinese not only had to deal with Japanese advances in the region, but were also engaged in a civil war between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. During the Meiji era, the Japanese dedicated themselves to developing their military forces, achieving considerable superiority over China by the 1930s. This superiority enabled the rapid conquest of several Chinese territories during the Sino-Japanese War. In this context, the Japanese in the 1930s conquered Manchuria, 1931, and various regions of China, such as Nanking, where one of the greatest massacres of World War II occurred. However, despite Japanese superiority, the Japanese Empire failed to conquer the entire Chinese territory. Throughout the Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945, the Chinese managed to hinder many conquests and delay the advance of Japanese military forces. It is in this context that the Nanking Massacre occurred. With the advance of Japanese troops, the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek faced a dilemma about whether or not to defend Nanking, as Anthony Beevor explains in his book The Second World War. Chiang Kai-shek could not decide whether to defend Nanking or abandon it without resistance. The city was indefensible, but abandoning such an important symbol would be humiliating. His generals disagreed. In the end, the worst happened, with an incomplete defense that only served to infuriate the attackers. The massacre in Nanking began with the arrival of the Japanese troops, as Beevor describes. Japanese troops entered the city with orders to kill all prisoners. A unit in the 16th Division alone executed 15,000 Chinese prisoners, and one company beheaded 1,300. A German diplomat informed Berlin that, in addition to mass executions by machine guns, other individual methods were also used, such as pouring gasoline on victims and setting them on fire. Wounded Chinese soldiers were killed on the ground with bayonets. Officers made prisoners kneel in rows and practiced beheading with their sharp samurai swords. Soldiers were also ordered to practice bayoneting on thousands of Chinese prisoners tied or bound to trees. Older soldiers organized mass rapes, with more than 30 men per woman, whom they usually killed after they were done with them. The city's buildings were looted and burned. To escape murder, rape, and destruction, civilians tried to take shelter in the International Safety Zone. 6 or 7 Japanese soldiers arrived, all armed with pistols and knives hanging from their waists. They took 6 or 7 women from the crowd of refugees. I was among those captured. There was also a young woman I recognized. Her name was Chaozi. A Japanese soldier forced me into an empty room. I remember he was chubby and had a beard. Once we were both in the room, he used a knife to force me to take off my pants. I would be killed if I didn't. And that's how I was raped. My husband knows that I was raped by a Japanese soldier, but he sympathized with me. He passed away a few years ago. At home, I can't bear to tell my sons and daughters, and I'm worried that others will find out and despise me. What happened in Nanking still hinders relations between countries to this day. Even in the 21st century, the Chinese are still outraged by Japan's current attitudes, as exemplified by researcher Alana Camosa Gonçalves de Oliveira. The rape of Nanking causes discord between China and Japan well into the 21st century, as some Japanese historians insist that the death toll estimates are lower than those claimed by the Chinese. As a result, Japanese history books are constantly criticized by Chinese authorities, who insist that the Japanese archipelago relativizes or denies its past atrocities. Regarding the events in Nanking and the disagreements over the facts, historian Anthony Beaver describes the following. Reports on civilian casualties vary widely. Some Chinese sources speak of 300,000, but the more likely figure is around 200,000. In a series of clumsy lies, the Japanese military authorities claimed to have killed only Chinese soldiers in civilian clothes and that the death toll was little more than 1,000. The scenes of the massacre were hellish, with rotting corpses everywhere on the streets, many torn apart by feral dogs. All the lakes, streams, and rivers were polluted with decomposing corpses. In recent years, tensions between nations regarding historical facts persist. China and South Korea, since the end of World War II, have awaited a formal apology, which, in their view, has not occurred, for the events that took place during the conflict. In 2015, Japanese leader Shinzo Abe made a public statement referencing the anniversary of the end of World War II and commented the following: Japan has repeatedly expressed feelings of deep remorse and sincere apologies for its actions during the war. We have consistently dedicated ourselves to peace and prosperity in the region since the end of the war. History is harsh. What happened cannot be undone, but we must not let our children, grandchildren, and even future generations who had nothing to do with that war be predestined to apologize. The following year, Japan refused to pay its share of the UNESCO funding due to the inclusion of documents from the Nanking Massacre in the Memory of the World Register. In addition, Japanese forces engaged in virtual slavery, forcing people into labor or prostitution. The use of sexual slaves, known as comfort women, was systematic and widespread in countries such as Korea, China, Thailand, and others under Japanese control. Moreover, captives were subjected to inhumane experiments, the most notorious example being Unit 731. Established by imperial order, this military unit conducted experiments on civilians based on the former Department of Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification of the Kwantung Army. Unit 731, authorized in 1936, had bases in several locations in China. Researchers of Unit 731, known as prison camps, referred to their victims as maruta, which means logs in Japanese. There were no limitations regarding the people used in experiments, including Chinese, Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, and American prisoners of war. The atrocities committed by the doctors of this unit exceeded ethical boundaries and pushed scientific method to disturbing extremes. One experiment aimed to study the effects of lethal doses on humans, intentionally infecting victims with deadly contagious diseases such as the bubonic plague. They dissected the bodies while still alive to prevent decomposition. Anesthesia was not administered so as not to interfere with observations, and the victims were conscious during vivisection. Another experiment involved amputations to test the limits of the human body. Limbs were frozen and thawed to study the development of gangrene and frostbite. In some cases, limbs were cut off and sewn back onto opposite sides. Entire organs or parts of organs were removed from many victims, and some were disconnected and reconnected in unnatural ways. Experiments with exposure to poisonous chemicals, animal blood infusions, blood centrifugation, burns, and X-rays were also conducted. Tests continued until the victim died, as the goal was to determine the limits of human endurance. It is surprising to find that many people raised in Japan learned little about the country's 20th century history during their school education. According to a 2013 BBC report, a major history textbook used in Japanese schools, dedicated only 19 out of its 357 pages to the events that occurred between 1931 and 1945. For example, the Nanking Massacre, one of the most brutal episodes committed by the Japanese army, was mentioned in just one line. The way the war is presented to children in Japan can be summarized by the following phrase, as described by historian Stephanie Ambrose. One day, for reasons we never understood, the Americans began dropping atomic bombs on us. This simplistic description of the events raises the question of whether it is accurate or merely a convenient selection of information made by the victors and the historical villains. On this delicate point, it is very difficult to obtain any direct opinion, let alone a consensus. The main candidate seems to be General Hideki Tojo, who, as Japanese Prime Minister at the time of Pearl Harbor, symbolizes to Americans the Bushido spirit of Japanese military fanaticism during World War II. But he is rarely mentioned in textbooks. Masanori Komiya, a 19-year-old student from a high school in Tokyo, knew Tojo only as a bad politician who failed to control the military. When pressed about the reasons for the war and who might be responsible, he blurted out, "There's nothing inside us that compels us to ask our parents why, nothing that suggests guilt or responsibility." In a politics and economics class, journalist James Reston Jr. asked his students a few questions. Virtually all of the 200 students in the class said they had learned nothing about Japanese history since 1930, or only the most superficial details. The emphasis was on ancient eras and the Middle Ages. When a teacher reached the Meiji era, which began in 1868, the pace of instruction began to speed up. Many students reported that their teachers ran out of time at the end of the academic year, shortly before 1930, and were instructed, if students were interested, to read the rest of the book on their own. No student could recall ever having answered a question related to modern Japanese history on the important college entrance exams they had taken. Thus, it became clear that all questions about how to frame events such as the Nanking Massacre, Pearl Harbor, the invasion of China, the atomic bombings, and the colonization of Korea are essentially moot. In practice, the history after 1930 simply is not taught. Teachers consider the post-1930 period too politically sensitive. There is also little interest in the 1930s among Japanese university scholars. This contrasts sharply with Germany, where studies on the 1920s and 1930s are extensive. As a result, young Japanese people have virtually no understanding of how Japan entered World War II, who the main leaders were, or whether Japan's cause was just or immoral. The cataclysm simply happened in the flow of history. There is much talk of Japanese peace education. But there is irony in this. The curriculum is shallow, inconsistently used, and lacking in foundation or follow-up. The instruction that exists emphasizes Japan as a victim of war. To truly understand this issue, it is necessary to understand the Japanese educational system. What students learn in Japan is directly related to the school they attend and the decade in which they were born. Unlike most countries in the European Union, the textbooks used in Japanese schools are published by private companies rather than a central authority. The role of the Ministry of Education is limited to approving the textbooks, while each school district can select a book from a list of approved materials. Initially, this system was considered a beneficial step in the post-war period, as it represented the spread of American capitalist views of privatization in Japan. Moreover, on the surface, it prevented political interference in education, which at the time seemed like a favorable idea, since the political system had been established during the recently defeated Japanese Empire. However, as mentioned earlier, the government still exerts influence in the textbook selection process through a special council within the Ministry of Education responsible for content approval. At this stage, the government used its power to reject textbook drafts for reasons considered controversial. Allegedly, merely mentioning the crimes committed by the Japanese Empire before 1945 was enough to exclude a book from school lists. These cases occurred not only in the 1950s, but also in the 2000s. It is worth noting that it is not the simple mention of massacres like that of Nanking that can lead to the exclusion of a book, but rather the use of a negative tone regarding the actions of the Japanese Empire at the time. Although the government does not officially deny the crimes committed, it also does not appear to actively discourage the denial of war crimes, even among members of parliament. Japan's approach to the war crimes committed during World War II differs from that adopted by other defeated nations, such as Germany, and this is considered peculiar. While in 17 European countries, the denial of the Holocaust is explicitly prohibited by law, in Japan, there is no similar legislation. Furthermore, in the education systems of those European countries, war crimes are addressed in meticulous detail, not only in history class, but in nearly all other subjects, except perhaps mathematics and physics. The difference in Japan's approach to war crimes can be attributed to a number of factors. Unlike the Nazi regime in Germany or the fascist administration in Italy, Japan's defeated leadership could not easily be used as a politically isolated scapegoat to assign all the nation's crimes to them. In fact, Japanese leadership did not undergo such drastic changes as in other Axis countries after the war. Emperor Hirohito, for example, remained a central figure, although he was stripped of many of his powers and renounced his divinity. This resulted in the formation of a new democracy in Japan, with many ties to a period that the Japanese wished, and perhaps still wish, to be proud of. Additionally, the Japanese Empire had no predecessor that could serve as the foundation for a new or re-established system of government, unlike the European Axis powers. While American forces occupied Japan under General MacArthur from 1945 to 1952 and brought many accused war criminals to military trials, many high-ranking officials allegedly guilty of war crimes escaped judgment. However, Japan officially issued many apologies after the war and even reached agreements with formerly colonized countries, such as South Korea in 1965. Despite these efforts, generations raised after the war learned very little about the atrocities committed during the conflict. One reason for this was the involvement of Cold War politics in the teaching of history. In July 1955, 2 years after the end of the Korean War, textbooks that included atrocities committed by the Japanese army were condemned by the Japanese parliament. The stated reason was that textbooks should not contribute to portraying communist countries in a favorable light. The invasion of China and the occupation of Manchuria were to be omitted whenever possible. Textbooks that explicitly addressed Japanese actions against countries that had used war as a way to attack capitalist Japan and thus implement policies that could be seen as communist were labeled red in the context of rising Cold War tensions. This stance toward history intensified, resulting in the banning of more than a quarter of the books used in schools at the time. One solution to avoid being banned was for authors to completely skip this period or cover it only in a summarized way. Therefore, it's not surprising that history books had more pages on the Paleozoic era than on the Pacific War. Furthermore, the involvement of the Cold War may explain why the Americans did not oppose this approach and did not push for change in the post-war period. A widely used current school text, written by 3 well-known professors from the University of Tokyo, dedicates part of only one sentence to the nuclear events. It says, "While the Japanese government was trying to deal with the Potsdam Declaration on August 6th in Hiroshima and August 9th in Nagasaki, the United States dropped atomic bombs. There is nothing written about the special nature of the devastation, and there is no image." The Japanese also resist the association of Tojo with Hitler, as time has softened the once harsh attitude toward Tojo. For years, Tojo was scorned and ridiculed for his failed suicide attempt when American soldiers arrived at his home to arrest him. "The Germans can blame Hitler for everything," said Teiichi Sato. "His discriminatory policy was his own. In our case, leadership was collective. Everyone has to carry the burden of the past. When everyone is guilty, individuals are exonerated. Historically, the acceptance of collective guilt took the form of a statement on August 28, 1945, by Prince Higashikuni, who was the prime minister of a provisional government in the first 2 months after the war. Known as the Confession of 100 Million People, it involved all Japanese citizens in the war and in the defeat. Higashikuni believed that collective confession was the first step toward Japan's reconstruction. Some trace this reluctance to assign political blame to the imperial system. Only the emperor could declare war, therefore the political leadership behind him was absolved. And yet, in this 60th year of Emperor Hirohito's reign, few are willing to punish the gentle old man. Instead, again a matter of emphasis, it has become a sacred truth in Japan that the emperor, and not the Americans, kindly ended the Pacific War by breaking a deadlock between the fanatics and the doves in the war cabinet with his vote for the nation's surrender. Meanwhile, in Aichi Prefecture, General Hideki Tojo is buried alongside 6 other men executed by the Americans as war criminals. The inscription on the tomb reads, "The Grave of the 7 Martyrs." As time goes on, the influence of the Cold War ceases to be the main factor behind this view of history. In fact, in many cases, Japanese citizens have begun to seek opportunities to learn about the war, despite the dark aspects of their country's past, whether through school itself or by other means, such as exposure to Western media. However, controversies still persist, largely due to the rise of nationalism on both sides. Even though these events took place many decades ago, when even many of our grandparents were still babies, the lack of comprehensive education on these subjects and the reasons behind them can lead to a range of tensions and conflicts in contemporary Japanese society. Although they may appear similar at first glance and share political institutions, the relationship between Japan and South Korea is marked by complexity and tension. Both countries face common challenges, such as the issue of North Korea and relations with China and Russia, but they frequently demonstrate antagonism and become involved in trade wars. In contrast, Germany assumed responsibility for its actions during the war, establishing a harmonious alliance with France and facilitating reconciliation, despite the historical rivalry and occupation during World War II. The pursuit of greater power is common among nations and is often associated with military expansion and a vision of national superiority, resulting in intolerance and cruel acts. Japan is no exception, just like other nations that follow similar patterns. Frequently, throughout modern Japan, there is a visceral repulsion toward war, even if there is no complete understanding, or any widespread attempt to understand, the causes of the war. Most of the time, one only hears, "This must never happen again." That's the kind of promise my teenage son would make, said a social psychologist from Keio University. It's a promise made and quickly forgotten. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.